Welcome to International Geneva. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the 1949 Geneva Conventions. Together with their additional protocols, they form the core of international humanitarian law and regulate the conduct of armed conflicts and seek to limit their impacts. They protect people not taking part in hostilities and those who are no longer doing so. Today, the original documents are conserved here at the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum. 7 decades later, I'm going to ask several experts whether they are still relevant today and if Geneva can maintain its role as a global cradle of human rights. Lindsay, thank you so much for your time. So are the Geneva Conventions still relevant today, do you think?
This is a great question. It's interesting always for us to hear, are the Geneva Conventions still relevant? I mean, the Geneva Conventions embody a very fundamental basic principle, which is that all wars have limits, and those limits must be respected in order to preserve lives and dignity in times of armed conflict. Now, the thing is, the very basic rules of the Geneva Conventions are no one must be tortured. No one must be raped or subjected to sexual violence. Persons who are detained have to be treated humanely, given food, water adequately. Missing persons have to be searched for. The dead have to be treated with dignity. These are extremely basic rules that remain as relevant today as they were 70 years ago. And if only they were respected, you can imagine how much less suffering we would see in the world today. Now, the fact that they're not always respected also doesn't mean that they're not relevant, in the sense that, we often see traffic violations every day, but nobody says, okay, well, cars are speeding, so, the traffic laws are not relevant anymore. No, we look for ways to implement them better and to try and get everyone to comply with them better, and that's exactly what we do.
But is this enough? Does the scope for rights not need to be widened, because there are so many new challenges nowadays?
Well, it's a good question, and it's always a question of, do we have enough standards, or is it a question of how we interpret the standards? So some of the things that we see today in particular are, there's a lot more conflicts being fought in urban areas, and some estimates are that sort of 50 million people are affected by fighting in urban areas. So how do we interpret the law that we have now in order to take this into account, and what does it mean in what we look at the law? Then we have other challenges that we see, things like cyber warfare and autonomous weapons. Now, these pose very challenging questions, of course. What does it mean to have an attack in cyber? Do you have to have physical damage? Of course, for the position of the ICRC is that international humanitarian law applies also to cyber operations that are conducted in situations of armed conflict. But what do we need to do in order to interpret these rules, in order to make sure that they can continue to protect people? How can you distinguish between civilian persons and civilian infrastructure when everything in cyberspace is interconnected? So these pose really, really difficult challenges for us in interpreting the law and in looking at whether or not the law needs to be adapted. When it comes to things like autonomous weapons, of course, there are also a number of important questions that are raised. How will they be able to distinguish an autonomous weapon between a civilian and a combatant? How could it tell a difference between a hunter and a combatant? And how can we be sure? So for the ICRC, there will always have to be a human in the loop in order to ensure that that the laws of armed conflict can be respected, even with the changes in technology.
Now, Geneva has been the headquarters for the ICRC, and it's now changing a lot. It seems like International Geneva in specific is moving away from being an epicenter of human rights towards a web governance, a healthcare, hub. How do you see the future of the city here?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, for us, the Geneva is really the birthplace of international humanitarian law. And as much as that focuses on human and the protection of humans and human dignity, I mean, Geneva, I think in a lot of respects will remain synonymous with that. And as all of these other issues and factors have an impact on humans, then it's natural that Geneva is also a place where we discuss these things and where this becomes important. So I think it's natural that Geneva is sort of broadening its horizons in this way, but I think the fact that it will remain really the heart of humanitarian law and humanitarian thinking is natural.
So do you think that it will be able to maintain this pole position, or do you think that there will be a depolarization and maybe more other, cities in the world that could also boost their humanitarian ranking, basically?
Well, we're always happy for others, for more humanitarian, cities to take on more work on humanitarian initiatives. Obviously, this is always a good thing. But I think the fact that the International Committee of the Red Cross has been here for so long has also meant that there are a huge number of organizations that come to Geneva for this reason, and that it makes it a focal point, and I think it will remain that.
Anissa, thank you so much for joining us. 70 years of the Geneva Conventions, is this a reason to celebrate? Are they still relevant today?
Yes, indeed. I believe that it's a reason, it's a big reason to celebrate the elaboration of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. It's a reason for celebrate for different reasons. First of all, it was the time where they were drafted and elaborated marked really the progress of the international community in ensuring the protection of civilians in armed conflict after the Second World War in particular. And 70 years on, there was a lot of progress being made. 3 additional protocols were drafted to complement the Geneva Conventions, 2 in 1977 to address issues such as wars of national liberation or apartheid, but also what we called non-international armed conflicts, which are the conflicts that oppose states and armed non-state actors. And there was a final protocol elaborated in 2005 to address the issue of the emblem, the protection of the emblem in armed conflict. So definitely reason to celebrate.
A lot of people are saying, though, that the importance of IHL is waning. What do you respond to that kind of criticism?
I don't think it's really the importance of IHL which is waning. What we are witnessing today is rather a reluctance of states to implement IHL. And it's not only about IHL. The other day we had a small talk on the obligations pending upon states when migrants are crossing the Mediterranean Sea. And here the norms are there, the interest is there, states are much also focused in elaborating norms or interpreting norms, but the problem is the implementation of these norms. And this is a problem which is common to all international law fields, not only the law of armed conflict.
Do you think that big corporations are doing enough to tackle international human rights abuses and should do more maybe to boost IHL around the world?
Contrary to the cliché that corporations are not interested in human rights or in IHL, from my own experience I can say that big corporations are indeed interested in IHL and human rights. Why? Because they invest in countries that are facing armed conflict situation. So corporations are eager to operate while complying with international norms. So there have been an initiative which is called the Global Compact, to which many big corporations like Total, like other corporations have been following and adhered to. Of course, there are issues of implementation, or they are not legally bound necessarily by all of human rights obligations, but they have made efforts toward respecting, at least voluntarily, some of these norms. And, you know, if states do not respect IHL norms or human rights norms, of course, some corporations do not either respect the norms, but it's always good to see that they get more implicated. And I think it's always good to have them on board to promote the protection of civilians in armed conflicts.
The Geneva Academy also offers executive education in areas like human rights protection, armed conflict and international criminal justice. What kind of interest are you getting from business leaders and CEOs in these specific areas?
It's true that the executive master really has been followed by people working in international organizations rather than business companies. I think it would be great indeed if we would have more business partners, business executives following that kind of courses for them to be more aware of the norms that are applicable in this situation. So I don't think that for now we have many of this kind of public, but I would certainly encourage more of them to participate to our teaching program.
Let's take a look at Geneva as a city and as an epicenter for international humanitarian law and also human rights. Do you believe that it can maintain its status, and what kind of competition is out there?
There is some competition from other European cities. There are some issues linked to armed conflict which are dealt with, of course, in The Hague, but The Hague, for example, is much more focused on international criminal law and public international law because also of the presence of the tribunals there. There are Vienna, which also and the OECD, which also addresses these issues. That being said, and of course New York as well, that being said, Geneva will remain in the center of those discussions. Why? Because of the presence of all the different international organizations here, not only the ICRC, which is the big guardian of international humanitarian law, but also the UN Refugee, the UNHCR, the UN Agency on Refugees, also the WHO, because now all of the issues are interrelated. And because of the presence of all these actors here, Geneva has been able to allow the gathering of expertise and exchanges around these issues, which are all interrelated. And of course, I have to add the Human Rights Council, which is also here at the epicenter of human rights.
You wrote a book, Un droit dans la guerre, a law in war. Now, so many years later, would you say that the Geneva Conventions are still relevant today?
Well, it is true that the world has changed since 1949, that today most armed conflicts are non-international armed conflicts, that the Geneva Conventions have mostly articles on armed conflicts between states. Only one article is about non-international armed conflict. But the ideas expressed in the rules protecting the wounded and sick, prisoners, civilians, can be applied by analogy and are contained in customary rules which have developed under the influence of the Geneva Convention. So I would say they are not ideal, but it's the best we have for such a profoundly inhumane situation like an armed conflict. And it's better to have them than nothing. And unfortunately, it has turned out to become impossible now to adapt them to new challenges. So we have to live with the old rules, which is not impossible for lawyers. Look at the US Constitution. It's of the 18th century and they still live with that Constitution.
Why has it become impossible to adapt the Geneva Conventions?
Probably the world has become more varied with many more states. And the old rule in the field of humanitarian law, which is understandable, that there must be consensus, that everyone must agree. It would not be useful to have a treaty where just Sweden, Switzerland, Botswana, the Cape Islands are parties and not those who actually make war. But with 200 states it has become impossible, also because states are always afraid that a certain rule could one day be used against them. So they don't want additional rules for the time being. We can hope that times change. So for the time being, we are already happy that we have some rules which have been accepted by all states.
But does this not mean that their use and importance is waning? Will we have to scrap them?
Well, this would be very dangerous because, in my view, states would today take advantage of a reopening to introduce distinctions by saying a civilian is protected, but not if he or she is a terrorist, things like that. So, for the time being, I think the main problem is that they are not sufficiently respected because states do not want to have an efficient mechanism of implementation.
Now, there are so many challenges to international humanitarian law, like new technologies, cyber warfare, new forms of warfare. Which would you say is the biggest challenge now?
I think there are different challenges. So the main challenge is to find a mechanism to enforce the law, the willingness of states to respect the law even when they consider they are right. That's difficult because everyone is in favor of the Geneva Convention, but once they have been attacked or they claim to be attacked, they say, oh, now we have to defend ourselves. But these conventions are precisely made for that situation. But indeed, there are challenges with technology which up to today did not yet appear in the field. No one has died because of cyber war.
Now, there are also many views that Geneva's role as a center for international humanitarian law is weakening. Would you agree with that?
Well, for international humanitarian law, I don't think so, because the International Committee of the Red Cross is here. Humanitarian law is increasingly dealt with by the human rights bodies, and I think rightly so. But it is true that Switzerland, also it makes a lot of efforts, is less successful in bringing the international community together to develop international humanitarian law.
But do you think that Geneva as a city and as international Geneva should take more steps and measures to boost Geneva as a center and epicenter for international humanitarian law once again?
Well, I mean, one can always a little improve, but I mean, they do already a lot, but unfortunately in recent years not very successfully, because other states resist and don't want to have these additional rules. For instance, the whole fight against terrorism has certainly weakened humanitarian law, because everyone in the world fighting against rebels now calls them terrorists and says, you don't want to protect terrorists. And therefore, if you convene a conference in Geneva, for instance, to improve the protection of detainees in non-international armed conflicts, the ghost in the room is terrorism. And no one wants to adopt any rules protecting terrorists.
Now, not just on IHL, but also on human rights. The US pulled out of the Human Rights Council last June. Was this a major setback as well?
It depends, because what is important is that the US remains a party to the treaties and is bound by the rules of humanitarian or of human rights law here. But it is true that it is a certain symbol when the most powerful state says somehow we do no longer cooperate to improve the human rights situation, then other states which violate much more human rights law will be even less willing to work together. But for the time being, as you see now, the Human Rights Council continues to work, and my main concern on human rights is rather that public opinion loses faith in human rights. So it's not only governments have always violated human rights, but now they don't hide it anymore, but they are proud of it. They try to exclude people. And public opinion, or a part of public opinion, elect politicians who have on the program to violate human rights.